All right, everyone positions for this mechanic. Healers, keep everyone above 50%.
I can only do what I can do. If people stand in fire, it's not my fault they die.
They're not standing in fire. They're taking raid damage from the boss.
Sounds like a DPS problem. You should kill faster.
Okay, let's reset and try again. Focus on positioning.
I'm not healing this. You guys are too spread out.
We're in the correct positions.
Not according to my healing plan. Bunch up more.
The mechanic requires spread positioning.
Then you need a better healer. I can't heal spread. Find a new one.
We wiped. What happened?
You guys are impossible to heal. I'm done trying.
We were doing fine until you stopped healing midway through.
Because you weren't following my strategy. When you do what I say, I'll heal. Until then, wipes are on you.
That's not how this works. We need to work together.
Work with me or replace me. But you both know you can't replace me? Good luck finding a healer mid-tier who's as good as I am.
Technically, we could replace you.
Could you? You've been trying to recruit a second healer for 6 months. Nobody wants to join a guild with this kind of drama. I'm stuck here, and you're stuck with me. So either we do things my way, or we don't raid.
We have to do things their way now, don't we?
Exactly. Welcome to understanding your position.
Welcome back to MMO Madness Behind the Troll Mask. I'm Boss Mode, and today we're talking about healer hostage situations. When the person keeping your group alive learns they can use the power as leverage. We're talking about healers who weaponize their irreplaceability. Groups forced to restructure themselves around one person's demands. And the weird power dynamic that emerges when someone becomes too essential to replace. Let's explore the psychology of being indispensable and what happens when that goes wrong. Here's the fundamental truth about healing in MMOs. The role is genuinely more difficult to replace than other roles, and that creates a power dynamic that gets weaponized. In most MMOs, you need exactly one healer per group or raid. Not one DPS, one healer. There's usually flexibility with DPS. You can run with 2 or 4 or 6 depending on the content. But healers are fixed. You need at least one and usually not more than 2 or 3 depending on group size. This creates immediate scarcity. If you have 20 DPS capable players, you might only have 2 or 3 of them as primary healers. The healer role has lower population than DPS roles because healing is stressful. You're responsible for keeping everyone alive. When people die, it's often the healer's fault in perception, even if it's not their fault in reality. This scarcity makes healers valuable and they know it. A good healer can join almost any group and get welcomed immediately. A bad tank or DPS might struggle to find groups, but a competent healer always has options. That scarcity translates into power. Now here's where it gets toxic. Some healers realize they can leverage that scarcity. If the group needs them more than they need the group, they have negotiating power. They can make demands that other roles can't make. Change your strategy to my preference or I'll leave, and you won't find a replacement quickly enough for the raid to even happen. The group faces a genuine dilemma. Losing the healer means the raid doesn't happen. Replacing the healer means spending weeks or months recruiting and training someone new. From a purely practical standpoint, the group is dependent on the healer continuing to show up. A healthy group manages this by having backup healers. You recruit 2 or 3 healers, so if one person has a bad day or decides to leave, you have options. But recruiting backup healers is hard because you need multiple people willing to do the stressful role. So many groups end up with one primary healer and maybe one backup who's inconsistent. Healer ego gets inflated by this necessity. A healer might start thinking, I'm the reason this group succeeds. Everyone else is just here to support my healing. They're not wrong, that role is essential, but they're wrong that it entitles them to run the group like a dictator. When a healer learns they're irreplaceable, some of them begin using that as leverage. Consciously or unconsciously, they start making demands. We need to do it my way, or I'm leaving. The group needs to restructure around my schedule. Everyone has to listen to me because I'm the healer. The group has a choice. Accept the demands or go through the painful process of replacing the healer. Most groups accept the demands because replacement is so painful, and that teaches the healer that demands work. The psychological shift happens gradually. At first, the healer makes reasonable requests based on their genuine burden. I need shorter raid nights because healing is exhausting. Well, that's fair. The group accommodates, then it escalates. I need to control the entire strategy because I understand healing better than you. That's less fair, but the group accommodates. Eventually, the healer is making absurd demands. Everyone has to acknowledge my superior skill or I'm leaving. I want the best loot even though other roles need gear. I should get paid more in the guild bank because I'm carrying. The group keeps accommodating because replacing the healer seems impossible. The worst part is that this dynamic is completely preventable through good group management. If guilds took healer recruitment seriously and had actual backup plans, no single healer could hold the group hostage. But most guilds treat healer scarcity as an inevitable problem rather than something they can solve through planning. Now let me tell you about what happens when healers actually start weaponizing their power. These are situations where one person's importance became one person's leverage. A Final Fantasy static had a primary healer who was genuinely skilled. They could heal through mistakes, they knew the mechanics, they were reliable. The static was grateful to have them because good healers are valuable. Then one day, the healer started making demands. They wanted to change the raid composition because they preferred a certain DPS ratio. The static had been running successfully with the existing comp, but the healer wanted it different. They demanded the group restructure around their healing preference. The raid leader said no. The current composition was working fine. The healer's response was immediate. Then I'm leaving. You won't find another healer of my skill. The static tried to call the bluff. They said, that's fine, we'll recruit another healer. The problem is they actually couldn't recruit another healer quickly. Good healers are in demand. While they were looking for a replacement, the healer who had made the demand started being petty during raids. They'd refuse to heal certain mechanics if the group wasn't executing them the way the healer preferred. They'd let DPS die if those DPS weren't following the healer's strategy. They'd use their position as healer to enforce their will. The healer was literally holding the group hostage with threat of leaving combined with active sabotage. After 2 weeks of this, the raid leader gave in. The group restructured to the healer's preference. New composition was implemented. Healer immediately became cooperative again, but the damage was done. Other group members resented that one person had held them hostage. Confidence in the raid leader tanked because they caved. The healer now knew that demands worked and continued making them. Eventually, half the static quit because they didn't want to be in a raid held hostage by a healer. The healer finally left too when the group fell apart, claiming it was everyone else's fault. A WoW guild had a stable healing roster, 2 main healers who rotated, a few backups. The primary healer was great at coordinating group strategy and had natural leadership ability. Then the leader started using their healing role as leverage for other things. They wanted the guild master to change loot policy. They wanted the guild to implement changes to DPS rotations that the healer preferred. They wanted members they didn't like removed. When the guild leader didn't immediately comply with demands, the healer would have a bad raid night. Their healing would be adequate, but not optimal. They'd be slow on saves, they'd make positioning mistakes, nothing that was technically wrong, just less effort. The message was clear: cooperate with my demands or healing gets worse. The leader recognized the manipulation but felt trapped. Replacing the healer meant finding someone of similar skill and availability. That was weeks of recruitment. The guild gradually implemented policies based on the healer's demand. Loot went differently, DPS strategies changed, members the healer didn't like were pressured out. The entire guild culture shifted to accommodate one healer's preferences. Other guild members eventually revolted. They started an anti-healer campaign saying the healer had too much power. But they couldn't replace the healer without breaking the raid team. So instead, they just left the guild and found one that wasn't held hostage. The guild eventually disbanded because it couldn't function with the healer in charge and couldn't survive without them. A tank in ESO was committed to their role. They'd been raiding with the same group for a year, but the healer had started being controlling about positioning and mechanics. The healer would demand the tank position the group in a very specific way. If the tank positioned differently, the healer would let people die claiming they couldn't heal from that position. The healer was essentially dictating how the tank did their job. The tank tried to address it. They had asked the healer to adapt to multiple positioning options because raid flexibility is important. The healer said no. They heal one way and the tank needs to accommodate them or people die. When the tank continued to vary positioning to avoid predictability, the healer started making threats. If you don't position exactly how I want, I'm leaving the group. The healer was threatening to abandon the group in the middle of raid tier if the tank didn't comply. This went on for several raids. The healer made a threat every time the tank deviated from the exact positioning the healer preferred. The tank finally just quit the group. They couldn't deal with being threatened by the healer every week. The group tried to find a replacement tank, but the healer's controlling behavior had damaged the group's reputation. The healer kept telling new applicants, "The tank didn't listen to me," as if it was the tank's fault. Eventually, the group fell apart. The healer kept raiding in other groups, never understanding that their behavior had destroyed the previous group. To them, they were just being a good healer by enforcing positioning standards. A roleplay guild in a fantasy MMO had a healer character who was central to the group roleplay. The healer's players started making demands about how other characters had to behave in roleplay scenarios. They said, "My healer won't heal characters who act this way," or "My healer will let your character die if you don't do what they say in character." They were using the game mechanic, needing a healer to survive, to control how other people played their characters. Other roleplay participants tried to work around it by recruiting another healer. But the first healer said if anyone recruited a second healer, they'd leave the entire community. They saw a second healer as threat to their power and leverage. The community became completely controlled by the healer's roleplay preferences. If the healer didn't like how someone was playing their character, that person got excluded from group events through threat of being left unhealed. Eventually, someone tried to establish a second healer anyway. The first healer followed through on their threat and left. But their departure was accompanied by a social media campaign against the community, claiming everyone was ungrateful and toxic. The community fractured over the drama. What's interesting is that the healer saw themselves as the victim. They'd left because the community wouldn't accept their demands. They didn't see themselves as holding the community hostage. They saw themselves as being persecuted for trying to maintain standards. A raid group had a primary healer who was good but difficult, competent at healing, terrible at communication. The healer would rage in voice chat when people made mistakes. The raid leader asked them to tone down the rage. The healer's response was, "I rage because people are bad. If you don't like it, replace me." Then they stopped showing up to raids for 3 weeks. The raid group tried to find a replacement healer, but every new healer they approached either knew the reputation of the existing healer's toxicity and didn't want to deal with that, or the existing healer had contacted them and talked them out of joining. The existing healer was actively preventing replacement by poisoning the reputation of the group. Meanwhile, they disappeared entirely, making the group non-functional. After 3 weeks of no raids, the raid group had to make a decision. Do they keep trying to find a replacement and risk the group dissolving? Or do they ask the toxic healer to come back on the healer's terms? They asked the healer to come back, the healer did, and the raid group has never addressed the toxic behavior because they're trapped. The healer knows they can disappear for weeks, and the group will suffer enough to bring them back on whatever terms they want. This group still exists, and they still can't replace the healer. They just accept the toxicity now. Here's our last story. A healer in a group finally had the realization that they were being held hostage by their own power. They made a demand and got immediately accommodated. Then they made another demand and got accommodated. Eventually, they realized the group was restructuring their entire existence around the healer's preferences. The healer felt gross about it. They didn't want to be running the group through leverage and fear. They wanted to, just heal. But they'd gotten so used to making demands that backing off felt like losing status. Eventually, this healer talked to the raid leader about the dynamic. They said, "I think I've been weaponizing my position and I want to stop. But I don't know how to give up the power without losing respect." The raid leader's response was important. The way you get respect isn't through power, it's through being someone people actually want to work with. The healer had to rebuild the relationship by being trustworthy without using their leverage. This healer eventually became a healthy part of the group again, but it required the healer to recognize the behavior and actively work against their own impulses to control. Most healers never have that realization. Let me talk about what happens psychologically when someone realizes they're essential to a group's function, because this is where healthy becomes toxic. Being genuinely needed feels good. It validates your existence. You matter to the group. That's a real human need. Feeling valued is important. A healer who keeps their group alive is actively providing critical value. But there's a psychological trap in that value. Once you realize you're essential, the question becomes, what can I get away with because, they need me? Some people's brains go immediately to exploitation. I'm essential, so I can demand things. This gets worse if the healer has experienced being undervalued in their life. A person who's always felt like they didn't matter might swing to the opposite extreme once they find something they matter for. I finally matter, and I'm never going back to not mattering. The power feels intoxicating. Being able to make demands and watch them be accommodated is incredibly reinforcing. Your brain learns that making demands works and making more demands works better. The escalation is almost automatic. Some healers have genuinely been disrespected before. Groups that treated healing as a thankless job, DPS who complained about healing, tanks who blamed heals for wipes. A healer who has experienced that might swing to overcompensating for being undervalued. They go from undervalued to demanding overvaluation. But here's the thing, the group also has responsibility. Groups that allow one person to hold them hostage are enabling the behavior. If the healer makes a demand and the group immediately accommodates, the healer learns that that's how to get what they want. Groups could instead say, no, we're not going to restructure around you, but here's how we can compromise. Some healers would rage and leave. But those groups might be better off with a different healer than staying with someone who weaponizes their role. The tragedy is that a healthy healer and a healthy group could have a great relationship. The healer matters, the healer is valued, and the healer is treated well. But they're not held to different standards because of their role. They're held accountable like everyone else. Their importance doesn't mean they get to be a dictator. Some of the best raid groups have learned to not panic when a healer threatens to leave. They say, okay, we'll miss you, but we're not going to change our group to accommodate demands. Here's the door. Sometimes the healer walks through it. Sometimes the healer realizes they were bluffing and backs down. But those groups usually had backup healers. They'd done the work to make sure no single person could hold them hostage. That's the real solution. Good group management prevents healer hostage situations entirely. For individual healers, the question is whether they want to be a healer in a healthy group or whether they want to be a tyrant in a group they've damaged. Most don't realize those are their actual choices. So how do we fix a situation where we're being held hostage by a healer? Or if you're a healer, how do you avoid becoming a hostage taker? If you're in a group being held hostage by a healer, the first step is acknowledging what's happening. You're not making compromises for group harmony. You're making accommodations because you're afraid of losing the healer. There's a difference. Once you acknowledge it, you have options. You can accept the situation and live with it. You can try to have an honest conversation with the healer about the dynamic. You can start recruiting backup healers immediately and commit to making changes once you have options. Or you can just leave and find a new group. The worst option is hoping it gets better on its own. Healer leverage doesn't improve naturally. It gets worse as the healer gets more comfortable using it. If you try to have a conversation, you need to be clear about what's happening. We've started making a lot of accommodations based on your threats to leave. That's not sustainable for group health. We need to either reset our relationship or find a new healer. Some healers will respond well to honesty. Some will rage and prove your point about the leverage. The strategic move is to immediately start recruiting backup healers while having this conversation. Let the healer know that you're going to solve the scarcity problem so they're no longer essential. Sometimes just knowing backup is coming is enough to make a healer dial back their demands. If you're a healer who's been using leverage, understanding what you're doing is important. You're not being a good healer by making demands. You're being a manipulative person who happens to heal. There's a difference between being good at your role and weaponizing your role. The healthiest healing is when you're genuinely good at healing and people want you in their group because you make the experience better. Not because they're afraid of you, not because you're the only option, but because being with you is actually pleasant. If you realize you've been holding a group hostage, you can resist it. Be reliable without making demands. Be flexible without losing standards. And be valuable without being irreplaceable. Some groups will never forgive the previous behavior, but some will give you a chance to rebuild. For new healers, the lesson is don't confuse being needed with being powerful. You have an important role that matters, but it doesn't entitle you to mistreat people and make demands. Your importance should make you more responsible, not less. The groups that work best have healers who understand they're doing an important job, but a job, not a status that comes with special privileges. And they have leaders who recruit enough healer options that no single person can hold the group hostage. Healer hostage situations are created by two things: healer leverage and group dependency. Fix either one or the situation becomes impossible. If you're being held hostage by a healer, acknowledge it and make a plan to solve it. Recruit backup options. Be clear about what behavior you will and won't accept. Some healers will leave rather than be accountable. That's better than staying with someone who uses their role as a weapon. And if you're a healer using your importance as leverage, understand what you're actually doing. You're damaging groups and destroying trust. You're turning your valuable role into a toxic power play. The best healers are the ones who know they matter, but don't need to use that as a weapon. They do their job well, they're reliable, and they're pleasant to be with. That's where real respect comes from. Next week on MMO Madness, we're diving into the Gatekeeper's Manifesto. I played it first. We're talking about players who gatekeep content, knowledge, and play styles. People who think their experience entitles them to judge how everyone else plays. That's gonna be fun. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, share, and support the podcast. And if you've been held hostage by a healer, or if you've been a healer and realized you were using leverage, email us at podcast@mmomadness.com. Until then, value your healers, but don't be held hostage by them. And if you're a healer, let your skill speak for itself. I'm Boss Mode, and thanks for listening.